Dr. Chris Kiptoo is the Principal Secretary in the Ministry of the National Treasury and Planning. He is the PS for the National Treasury. Dr. Harry, good morning.
Good morning to you.
Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thank you very much.
How does it feel? How does it feel?
Great.
Uh-huh.
I've been hearing and listening and watching, and I've always wanted to be here. And happy to be here today.
You had a plan.
Yes.
To be
He
here.
had a plan.
For such a time as this.
Yes, and he has completed his
He's
plan.
actualized his plan.
He's actualized it, yes.
Karibu sana.
Asante.
We're going to have an interesting one-hour conversation to welcome you to the show. CT has the day's proverb. This week the proverbs are from?
The Proverbs are from the Republic of Benin.
Right.
It is the 21st smallest country in Africa.
21st.
Yeah, meaning number one smallest is Seychelles. But now it's number 21.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That is if you were to give ranks. It's a teeny little country, sliver of a country, as I told you yesterday, that leads into the ocean. Many words do not fill a basket.
Many words do not fill a basket.
No, they don't.
P.S. What's your interpretation of this one?
That you could just talk. But what is important is performance. That's how I interpret.
Actions will fill the basket.
Actions speak louder
will
than
fill the
words.
basket to overflowing. Yes.
Words, nothing.
Words. Well, you might as well just get a hair dryer to blow air through it.
Oh, wow.
Same effect.
They say in Kenya kupiga mdomo.
Yes, ndio hivyo.
Piga mdomo tu.
Yes, unaongea tu.
Porojo. Bila anything. PS, you've been a PS for many years in government. You've served as PS for trade, for environment. You have acted as PS when others were not in office. And then now you are PS in the National Treasury. How do you compare the current posting to the previous ones?
This is the toughest of all the jobs I've ever had. And nothing comparable.
Both in private and public.
Yes, because this is just my entire life is just on this job. I begin at 5 a.m., sleep at 1 a.m. Most of the time, except probably the weekends.
By begin, you mean you're in the office at 5?
I'm in the office by 5.
And you leave the office?
Yes, even if I leave early, I'll still be working. And the earliest time I sleep is, midnight, 1 a.m. Every day. That's the job. And it is the busiest job. I hold the job of, I'm an accounting officer like other PSs for the National Treasury State Department. But I'm also the Principal Secretary for National Treasury. So I am in charge of both the national government, the parliament, judiciary, independent institutions, and I have to deal with all treasury issues relating to the entire government.
You're the one to disburse all the money that needs to be disbursed.
It's the job description of the Principal Secretary for National Treasury.
So one of them is, of course, making sure that we are paying our debt on time.
Yes.
Last week, the president, flanked by you and your cabinet secretary and others, announced to the country that we have dodged a bullet by floating Eurobond and getting $1.5 billion out of it. We have been able to pay $1.5 billion into the $2 billion bullet payment that's expected in June. The rest, $500 million, you said, was to come from other sources. What are these other sources?
Budget from our own domestic resources that we're going to collect from the Kenya Revenue Authority. And we expect that balance will be met. And so we are confident that we will settle the 2 billion by June.
Okay.
We already settled the 1.5 billion. And so the remaining is on course, and we will settle them on time.
And by on time, we mean by June?
By June, yes. Because we have a set timeline, and we endeavor all the time to honor our obligations. Just this Monday, we had to pay 152 billion debt obligations for the domestic debt. 107 billion, which was principal payments, and the balance being interest payments. And we do that every Monday, because that is our day that we settle our domestic debt obligations, and we take this very seriously because dawa ya deni ni kulipa, and we have to make sure we honor our obligations, because if we fail, that will be really bad for our nation.
So it seems as though a lot, and not seems as though, it actually is the case, that a majority of the revenue that comes is going towards debt.
Yes.
Is this fiscally responsible?
Actually, the state of affairs right now is like this. For every 100%, every money that we receive from KRA, 60% will go towards settlement of outstanding debt obligations or the debt due. And the balance we have now to use it to meet recurrent expenditure, pay counties, let alone pay development budget.
Okay, so let's look
this
at,
percentage seems to be a floating percentage. The president said 70%. You're saying 60. We've had another quarter 78%.
78%.
What exactly is it?
It all depends on the period that you use, because sometimes you could do an average of, say, last 5 years or last 1 year, or you just take today or yesterday. You look at the revenues that you had, and But I think on average, because they have done this analysis, on average, currently we are doing about 60% of whatever revenues we get, we settle our obligations. And if you do the breakdown of the budget, you will actually see that coming out very clearly.
Okay.
Yeah.
You obviously, because of a majority of those funds going towards the first charge of debt, that means that you're left with very little for the rest of the responsibility that Treasury has for the country. That means we're talking about counties in devolution. That means we're talking about, budgets that needs to be filled. So many other things are necessary with the little money that's left. How is that juggling exercise going? It would appear that it seems to be a bit of a trouble spot.
It's a tough one. That's why I think I'm happy that you want us to discuss the subject on fiscal consolidation, because really that is what we are doing now. We don't have a choice. We have to ensure that we reduce our appetite for debt, because it's not sustainable. Currently, our debt is rated high risk but sustainable. And if you look at the debt carrying capacity of Kenya, the countries are rated either high, medium, or low. There are three categories. So in 2021, before 2021, we were high carrying capacity, but we've been now on medium, and we don't want to come to the worst category. So instead, we want to make sure that we work around to ensure that we actually work towards minimizing the need to take debt. And our idea is, if we in the near future we can run a balanced budget, that will be the greatest aspiration that we will have achieved. We are looking at moving from, I think, 2018, 2019, our budget deficit as percent of GDP was around 7.1. Then the next year, 2021, we had 8.3%. 2022, 23 was 6.2%. When the last election, just before the election, the budget deficit was 6.2%. But because this government, when it came to power, it took the decision that it wants to engage in fiscal consolidation. The first supplementary that we undertook in October was to bring down the budget deficit as percent of GDP from 6.2% then to 5.7%. Then the budget that was passed by Parliament, which was read in June, brought the budget deficit to 4.4%. And the aspiration was that we move to around 3.9%, and over the medium term, work towards minimizing, if not eliminating completely, the need to borrow. And unfortunately, of course, we got shocks that affected us. We had the pressure of the exchange rate. Our shilling has weakened. So the amount the loan that we have in foreign currency has meant that we now have to raise more shillings to pay for the same. And so we went for supplementary this year, last year actually in October, to correct for the fact that the expenditures had risen by about 148 purely because of changes in exchange rate and interest rate movements. That is why the budget deficit now moved from 4.4% to 5.5% of GDP.
It's only on account of the forex fluctuation.
Yeah, only on account of that, because we wanted to still maintain the target that we had set. So it moved by 1.1% purely because of exchange rate and interest rate movements. Now, we are coming back in the next 1 month to another supplementary that aims to bring it down from 5.5% of GDP to 4.7% of GDP. And then you've seen that in the budget policy statement that we have now, we are moving back to 4.4% of GDP. And next year, we want to be at 3.9% of GDP. The whole idea is to try and really minimize. Because I think taking more debt means in a few years, instead of 60%, we're talking about 70, 80, and it is not going to be sustainable at all.
Okay.
So we really need to take that bold decision. And I think the debate is around how do you finance the budget? There are two ways. If you can finance a budget through revenues that you raise, if they are sufficient to cover the budget, then you don't need to borrow. But now, because we always are short of the revenues, then we have to borrow. So the balance is revenue, debt, and also expenditure. There is room also, instead of just focusing on raising expenditure, we also work on rationalizing the expenditure. It's not just revenue raising measures. It's also about expenditure, because I believe there is scope to still rationalize our expenditure and ensure that we have efficient expenditure. And I think this is the big debate that we have. And remember, the debt obligations we have, are historical. Like the Eurobond, which you asked, we have about $7.1 billion of Eurobond. $2 billion is coming to mature in June. And then we have another $900 million maturing in May 2027. We have another $1 billion maturing in February 2028. We have another $1.2 billion maturing in May 2032. We have another $1 billion that is maturing in February January 2034. And the last one of $1 billion maturing in 2048, February. So it's
and the new ones are starting to mature in 2029.
Yes, and you see, part of liability management now, that's how we managed on this Eurobond, is that we did a refinancing by settling, we did a buyback. We issued and also did a buyback. And the issuance now means that those ones will mature in 3 tranches. Instead, we wanted to avoid bullet payments like we have found ourselves where we have to raise $2 billion in one go, which is very, very difficult. It's not easy when we are struggling with other needs. So what we have done is that this $1.5 trillion will now, $1.5 billion will now mature in 3 tranches, 2029, 2030, 2031. And those are the times that we don't have maturing Eurobond, as I have already indicated.
I want to ask, I just want to ask, in this particular Eurobond that we are paying now, the 2 billion, the 2014 one. So when we went to the market in 2014 and got $2 billion, that's 200 billion Kenya shillings. Have you taken some time at the National Treasury to look where the money was spent? Or even if you look at the totality of the $7 billion Eurobond that we have borrowed so far in the last 10 years, can you tell us where the money has gone? Is there a direct allocation, and you say out of the 2 billion shillings, 200 billion shillings went into this particular project?
It is money is fungible. So when you get money, it all has to do with the fact that you are working within a year. So if you need to reflect now within the year, how did you use all the monies that you got? And I think I will want to look at it. The only thing I can say is that whatever was borrowed was within budget at that time. And so one has to see I think these are the big question always around how do we utilize the resources that we have.
So in this particular case, the $2 billion in 2014, what particular project had it been budgeted for, and was it utilized for those projects?
My understanding is that it was part of the budget deficit, so it was supposed to be borrowed to meet the funding at that time for the budget. I don't have the specific details on exactly why they went to borrow at that time. Perhaps maybe when you call me next time, I can come with some answers. But I know, just like now, we have a budget deficit that Parliament has approved, and we have a debt management strategy that we use that makes us to decide how do we borrow. Do we borrow externally or locally? But when we borrow, it is to meet the requirements of the budget. And mostly, it's development budget.
So, bearing in mind that it's development, so budget is approved by Parliament. And then there's an Appropriations Act that is assented to by President after going through Parliament. In the appropriations, every shilling is put into a specific vote.
Yes.
There is the recurrent, it goes into salaries and others.
Yes.
And then there's the development. And the deficit should go to development. When you borrow, rather, loans should go to development.
Not necessarily. It is just that you have a budget, like now of in this financial year, in this supplementary, we are saying our budget expenditure is 3.9 trillion. Our revenues are projected to be 3 trillion. So we have a budget deficit of about 881 billion shillings.
Yes.
Now we raise those resources, and once we have the 881 plus what we are raising from revenue from KRA of 3 trillion, then that is now appropriated accordingly.
So you're saying...
So you don't borrow to say, I want to borrow this, for development, for this, unless you are specific. Like, for instance, we issue infrastructure bonds. Those are earmarked now for specific infrastructure projects that are identified by ministries. But otherwise, we just need to, because you cannot raise all the revenues, you go to the market, you borrow, and you can borrow through domestic sources, or you borrow through external sources. External sources could be bilateral, it could be multilateral, or it could be commercial. All this, when you get the money, you use it as appropriated by Parliament.
So it's possible that the Eurobond was used to pay salaries and to pay operations of government?
It is possible, but most of the time you want to use the ordinary revenues to settle issues such as the salaries that come in, because they become fast charged. So when we give it priority from our revenues, just like debt, we use a lot of the time monies that we get from our revenues to settle our debt.
Okay. So most likely then, if that's not the most likely scenario, then the second most likely scenario is that the 2 billion shillings or the 7 billion shillings Eurobonds borrowed so far have gone to development. A majority of that money has gone to development.
It is a matter to confirm, but all I know is that money that you borrow could go to finance development projects. It could also finance recurrent expenditure.
But P.S., I know you have not been in that ministry for long. But there are those who work under you who've been in the ministry for long. From what your interactions with them, when money comes and it's 7 billion shillings, this is close to $1 trillion shillings, $7 billion.
Yes, $1 trillion shillings.
This is $1 trillion, Bob.
Yes.
This trillion shillings over the 10 years, what project can we say, because of going to the market for expensive commercial debt, we built this dam, this road, we connected these people to electricity. Is it
it is possible to show, I believe, because there are many development projects that have been done over that 10 years. I think the only thing is that I don't have the facts with me today to say this amount, 2 billion that was borrowed in 2014 went to this particular cause. I will need to check the history and see how that was expended. At least I can answer for the current situation, because I think I have facts around how we are using the resources we get.
I've always been puzzled. What is it that... No, in fact, why don't I let you ask the question you wanted to ask, then I can ask mine.
Well, no, I think it was all along the lines, because when we're talking about fiscal consolidation here, I mean, we don't know even a quarter even a tenth of what the folks at Treasury, the planners, the experts in their right, who come together to do a lot of these things, surely they must know that the situation in which Kenya is today is not a good one. But here we are also admitting that moving into the future, there will be constant borrowing to be able to meet budget deficits, and it is not healthy at all. But in order to get out of it, isn't it absolutely necessary that we should be able to know over the last 10 years, over the last 15 years, the money that is being paid today, this is what it was used for, and we can see the physical manifestation of what it was borrowed for. Because what it does is that it puts the country in a precarious situation. You admittedly said a few minutes before that you have very little left to then be able to do all the other things that you must do. And here we are saying, whether we like to admit it or not, that there's a chunk of money being paid ever so often that we cannot put a finger on in terms of where it went in the first place.
I think it would be unfair to say you can't put a finger on, because these monies are appropriated by Parliament and there is a vote for every expenditure. So one has to see how the money was expended by every accounting entity.
Bwana Piers, if 100 billion shillings was spent in Kenya today, 100 billion on a project, we would see it. We would feel it. If 1 trillion shillings has been spent over the years, it wouldn't be too difficult to be able to find it.
No, I think those can be available. Those can be availed. The only thing I was saying is that I didn't come with the list of projects here. Remember, 10 years is a long time. I wouldn't be able to get, but definitely that can be. I think what is important is to say, was there value for money in the projects or programs that we expended that money on? I think that is a valid question to ask. And part of it is answered by the Auditor General report. You will see, because all these accounts are audited, and you will see areas, some have clean reports, some have qualified reports. But clearly, for me, prudence is important. And this is what the folks at National Treasury, I can tell you, we're very competent staff, and we always apply our minds. Remember, budget making is not just about us. We come up with it's a public participation process. We go through a process, and then Parliament is the one that appropriates. Once Parliament appropriates, we live within what Parliament has approved or has appropriated. So in this case, what I am telling most Kenyans is that it's time to focus on two aspects that are important in our development: revenue raising measures and expenditure rationalization, to try and work on both fronts to minimize the need to borrow.
Dr. Chris Kiptoo is the Principal Secretary at the National Treasury. He's a man who, admittedly, by his own words, has a very difficult job, long days, trying to make sure that the country stays afloat and that there's development coming in, that people are able to make money so the government can raise revenue, so then the government can operate, so that it can create a conducive environment for people to be able to make more money. It's a tough one. City?
You see, when one talks of development and one talks of money spent on development, one understands why our borrowing actually has to be for development, because that development is what is supposed to help the economy grow. And the growth of economy is commensurate, as I said, with the livelihoods of people getting better, money being in greater circulation, things that the country wants to do gets done, whether you're talking about health services, whether you're talking about education. Now, when we say we spent X amount of shillings on certain projects, and we say, yes, this is the amount that we spent, I don't look at the projects, I look at the well-being of the people, and I ask, are people's lives better as a result of the money that we have spent? And if it isn't, why is it not so? Now, some may say it's a philosophical question. Yes, it is. But it's a question that must be asked. If we owe, it's 11 trillion? Okay.
11.2 now.
Yes. Do our lives reflect the lives of people who have had 11.2 trillion?
Who has an 11.2 trillion shilling debt.
Yes, spent on them. Because it ought to mean something. That really is my question. Now, the dovetail of this one is when we borrow, because the amount in itself doesn't even seem to be a problem until it's dollar denominated, and then it's not fixed. So my question was, why is it that it can't be fixed? Because we are borrowing in dollars anyway. It's not shilling denominated. And who determines who we borrow from? Why we borrow? Because we know of countries that lend you money at a 0.01% over God knows what period of time and give you a moratorium of God knows how long.
Good question. Let me break down this 11.2. 11.2 trillion currently is composed of domestic debt and external debt. Domestic debt constitutes 55%, which is actually 5 trillion. And the external debt is 6.1 trillion. Just about almost 1.5 years ago, it was 50-50, almost 50-50. But because of exchange rate, our own shilling weakening, those loans we took in foreign currency have now risen. That's why there's a balance. Now you have 6.1 and 5.5. Now of the 6.1, 50% of that is multilateral loan. That's from World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank. And 23% is from bilateral sources. The Chinas of this world, Germany and other countries. The balance of 27% is what we call commercial loans. And the terms for multilateral are quite concessional, actually below, mostly like World Bank, between 0 to 1%. In some cases, if you use other windows like IBRD, it can go up to 2%. And for bilateral sources also the same, because they are long term. The terms are quite low, below 3%. So 50 plus 23, that's 73% of our external debt are therefore generally concessional.
Okay.
The balance is now what we call commercial, the bulk of which is Eurobond, constituting 27% of the 6.1 trillion Kenya shillings. The domestic debt is composed of Treasury bills and Treasury bonds. 85% of the domestic debt is Treasury bonds, 11% is Treasury bills, and the balance is what we call others, including our overdraft at the central bank. So, what determines how the borrowing? As long as Parliament approves borrowing, Treasury is required to come up with a debt management strategy, what we call MDTRS, medium-term debt strategy. And in this strategy, what we try to do is we try to minimize cost of borrowing and to also minimize refinancing cost. Remember, when debt is due, either you pay or you refinance.
Yep.
Like every Thursday, last week, for instance, I'll give an example. We had gone to the market. We floated at 24 billion issuance. We got more, but we could only get 20. We could only take 23 because of the pricing. But maturing on Monday was 30 billion. So what happened? We were to pay 30. We only took 23. So 7 billion is what we could not raise. So what happens? You use the exchequer to pay. That's what we call refinancing. If you don't have sufficient money, then you could find yourself in a situation where you may not be able to meet your outstanding obligations. So the debt strategy, therefore, is looking at how to balance the risks around and making sure you go low on cost. So the strategy is, if you do domestic borrow, go long term, use Treasury bonds. If we are doing external, we are using concessional.
Yep.
And especially now that we have done a lot of the work around Eurobond, the remaining focus will be around raising money, but from concessional sources. So we have IMF, for instance, that now is at the World Bank. We expect about $3 billion that we will be getting the rest of the year, and through ADB and other sources. We are also beginning to think of options beyond Eurobond. So we were in Japan recently, and we are looking at samurai bond, for instance, which is quite low in terms of even if though it's a commercial, it's a market-based debt, but it is the borrowing is low. We have also pandable, for instance. So these are measures that or instruments that we are using for as long as we are unable to balance our budget and still have to go to the market.
What would it take to balance the budget? And that's the thing now, because you've spoken of that as a need. So what does it take to actually balance the budget, consolidate all of this, and then go to the next issue, which right now, where Kenya is, does Kenya need to borrow in order to survive?
From where I sit, and I've been here now for a while, but it's at the National Treasury, I strongly believe Kenya is in a position to be able to run a balanced budget in the near future. And it will require a lot of sacrifices for us to make. First, we need to all raise the revenues that we need for our expenditure. And remember, as we carry the budget, we must meet the requirements of the people. For instance, now, the education sector is consuming nearly 700 billion shillings to finance free primary education, free secondary. And the population is increasing all the time. We have the social sector and all that. We have to meet all the development needs. So we believe that both tax and non-tax measures that we are applying could enable us raise. And I think this government has been quite ambitious. I will tell you that the revenues that we have generated in this budget, as of January, what KRA collected was 1.5 trillion.
Yep.
And that is 14.4% increase in the revenue compared to 9.8% the previous year. So one can say 14% is quite good. So KRA has done well. The problem is that that 1.5 trillion is 200 billion less
than the target
or below target, because we set a higher ambition for KRA. Remember, we said we want to triple revenue from 2 trillion to 4 trillion. So now we have moved in this financial year, we are talking about 3 trillion revenues. And next year, in this PPS that we have come, we are now before Parliament, we are saying we want the revenues to be 3.4 trillion.
But then, PS,
yes,
isn't that where questions will start emerging? When you are projecting your revenues, I thought you would use the previous experience as your basis. If previously this is how much you're able to raise, why would you be projecting something that looks unrealistic and then you end up missing targets constantly? This time, you've raised 1.5 trillion in the first half. Commendable, yes, but short of target. Why? Because you overestimated your revenue raising. And that also is what determined how much your overall budget is.
I think it's a good question. It's a valid question you raise. But I also want to tell you that we think there is scope for KRA to still catch up. We are now sitting on about, we've cleared this, but about 2 weeks ago, we had 300 billion worth of exchequer requests, which we had not paid. This week, we have managed to pay almost over 120 billion that we have been able to release to the market, including development budget. So that money will go to improve liquidity in the system, and KRA will be able to collect. And so we expect that that gap, KRA will close as we go towards end of the year, towards June. And it's good to stretch a little bit, because if we still work on lower targets, sometimes we remain suboptimal. We are pushing and pushing and pushing to make sure that we increase tax compliance, and also we broaden the tax base.
Okay.
And, we believe that we need to deploy, for instance, we are supporting KRA already. We have given it additional budget, about 10 billion, to deploy technology, because there are so many leakages. That we believe if we use technology, we could be able to seal those leakages.
Okay.
For instance, ICMS, what we call Integrated Customs Management System, we need to improve on it. The iTax system, the electronic tax invoicing management system, all these which they have already started deploying, and we have seen a lot of impact already in terms of revenue. So with more support, we have, if you look at our national tax policy, there are areas that we have identified as difficult to raise taxes. For instance, the agriculture sector. the agriculture sector contributes almost 25% of GDP, but it's an area that contributes quite little when it comes to revenue, or raising taxes, because most of the activity, and there are also many informal areas where you don't have recording. We don't have you don't have good books of accounts, and it's a cash-based economy.
Yeah.
So all these efforts that the KRA is doing to reach out is
to increase that revenue,
to bring more people into the tax bracket.
Now, for this balanced budget to happen, you need to increase the amount of revenue you're collecting, but also at the same time curtail on growth of expenditures. And the expenditure here, a lot of it is recurrent, Bwana PS. If you just look at what the Auditor General told us the other day, out of an 800 billion shilling budget on development, you've not even done 30% of it so far in disbursement to development. That means a lot of the money that's coming in is going into paying salaries, paying electricity, buying new cars, buying salmon for some offices.
I can tell you.
And people start back and ask themselves, so how are we going to have a balanced budget if we are not going to cut back on expenditure?
I think
what is it that we are going to do to cut back on, to control expenditure? So that expenditure goes more towards development and less towards recurrent. Are you going to cut back on salmon consumption? Are you going to cut back on buying new vehicles?
Can we use one car instead of four?
Yeah. Are you going to have staff rationalization, aka, what's it called, Ziti? Firing of people from government. Redundancies.
Actually, that is where we need to stay more. We need to, I believe there is waste, as you see even the Auditor General raising. I acknowledge that there is room for us to look at waste in government and reduce it. And you look at what I have done at the National Treasury, just as a accounting officer, and I think I saw Nation actually carried this as a headline. I appointed a team of staff, and we looked at our own situation, and we said we need to implement austerity measures, and we agreed on a raft of measures which we believe will result in significant reduction in expenditure. No more mandazi, you don't see any more tea. We only have water for our staff at the National Treasury. We have said flying to Mombasa will only be for the cabinet secretary, maybe the principal secretary and senior staff who may, by virtue of their busy nature of the job, cannot travel. If you have to go, we use SGR. And we are working also on other measures like common printer. Instead of everybody having a printer, we want to use email rather than doing a lot of paperwork. There is still a lot of work, including even construction. We try to do energy saving bulbs. I don't know whether you guys here are compliant in terms of energy efficiency.
Yes.
But there is a lot of scope. The need to do. We stop any further constructions where we can, and so this is the conversation we're having. And the travel, there's tremendous cut in travel, and you may see even the delegations that we had recently, those who accompanied the president, even some of those who go, we hardly get many of our staff going the way they used to go. We have drastically cut that expenditure. So we're asking every accounting officer to work hard to ensure that we reduce the expenditure and reduce the waste. We believe also common user items that we buy can be are very overpriced. You may do a procurement legally, but you find that this bottle could still be more expensive than what is in the market. So what we have done is we are now going to electronic procurement, what we call e-procurement. And we are hoping to complete this in a short time so that all common user items will be procured electronically.
I'm sorry for sounding cynical,
yes.
PS, but I've heard this from Treasury mandarins for many years. All cabinet secretaries in the National Treasury have come up with, cost-cutting measures. Uhuru Kenyatta drove to Parliament in a Passat and said, now we are going to 1.8 litres. It didn't last. We have seen, let's cut back on our travel. It did not last. What long-lasting measure do you need to do to cut back on recurrent expenditure? And what can you do to increase on development expenditure?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Let me ask a direct question.
Okay.
Do you think the civil service is overstaffed?
Good question. I think majority of the ministries are still complaining that they don't have sufficient staff. But I think the public service, because of the wage bill that is there, we cannot continue hiring. And I think we're working with the Salaries and Remuneration Commission to see how that can be addressed. But I think a lot of staff are also reaching retirement. I recall there was a PS in trade, for instance, one time, and the average age of my staff was 52 years. So if I stayed for another 6 years, it means that ministry
all
will
of
not
you will
have
be
years.
retiring.
So we have to also look at age and make sure that we recruit young people so that those who are aging can be able to take off. So it's not possible to stop recruitment.
Is our wage bill sustainable?
It's at the moment, yes, but I think if we continue, it will not. We cannot say it's sustainable because I think the entire budget needs to be relooked at. For me, more importantly, is productivity. What is every employee doing in terms of meeting productivity? I think we need to focus not just in terms of wage, but also on productivity of very staff. And I think this is what we are doing now, pushing everyone to make sure that they're able to deliver, so that we have a public service that is productive, that its productivity is high.
I want to ask a question on the domestic debt, if you don't mind, City.
Please ask.
Domestic debt, like you've said, 5.5 trillion shillings domestic. 45% of our loan book is domestic. It's becoming more and more expensive. Recently, you went to the market. You were seeking, 90 billion? You came out with 240 billion shillings at 18%. Is this sustainable? You've locked out everybody else. City has business. He can now go to the market to borrow because he'll be charged 24% upwards interest rate. So the private sector is locked out because the government is going and taking very expensive domestic debt. What's the strategy here?
My friend, Eric,
Yes.
put yourself in, for a moment, let's change our jobs. And just put yourself in a position where I have given you the facts that I have indicated to you on the situation we are in. What option would you take? We have a budget deficit that has been approved by Parliament, and through the medium-term debt management strategy, we have identified that domestic borrowing, out of the 881 billion that we have to borrow, 471 will have to be from domestic sources. By just 2 weeks ago, we had done 207 billion, struggling to raise whatever has been approved in the market. So what we did is that because of the successful year issuance of the Eurobond, there was confidence building. And we saw a lot of interest in the infrastructure bond, especially from foreigners. Our interest rates are market determined. We don't say we want to take at this rate. It is what the market directs. And you have seen that rates have gone up because of tightening of monetary policy. So we managed to get 288 billion shillings. Because some of them were very expensive, we could not take, but we managed to get 240 billion. And out of the 240 billion, we've been able to pay out. And this is what you see how liquidity has improved. But 18% is expensive, yes, but it's not like the first time that we have been there before. It is the market conditions that dictate. Accessing liquidity now is very tight. And I agree with you, government is crowding out private sector. It is true. In fact, our worry is that, and this is why I'm pushing hard myself to say that we really need to go for a balanced budget. Because if we can actually stop borrowing, and then we now allow banks to do what is required, which is to lend to the rest of the economy. But it is now, most of them are also investing in government paper, and I have seen even individuals now beginning to also, just instead of investing in other businesses, just put in government paper, you get 18%. But it's the circumstances we are in. We have to run a government. We have only done what is right, which is to go to the market. It's a free market, and we could not dictate the interest rates. We have had to take that, but as we go forward, we believe that this will be sorted. That's why we didn't take for 18 years. We have gone for shorter dated securities, like 7 years in this case, because and of course we can also amortize. It means also that when the market situation improves, we can always get rid of that. Yeah.
Bwana PS, we thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Chris Kiptoo is the Principal Secretary for the National Treasury in the Ministry of the National Treasury and Planning. Asante sana.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.